Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the Restoration. I am your host, Steven Pynakker, and we are doing something very special. First of all, I have this really cool, awesome guest, Kyle Beshears, who came all the way from Mobile, Alabama, to come to my Christian community to talk about Mormonism, but a special flavor of Mormonism. Kyle, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
So this is very exciting. Now, I have to tell you, folks, we're at my community, Christian community here in Bradenton, Florida, called Christian Retreat. A shout out to Pastor Phil for letting us use the facilities, and a shout out to my homie, Rick Bennett of Gospel Tangents, who's manning the camera, and he's going to be interviewing Kyle this afternoon as well. So this is kind of a 1-2 punch of Mormon Book Reviews and Gospel Tangents. So what is so cool about Kyle is, first of all, he has this really, really interesting story about Mormonism. He's kind of like the Steve Pynakker of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but that's with a capital D and not a lowercase d. We're talking about what are some people refer to as the Strangite Church, right?
Yes, yeah.
Now, that's what's, we're going to be talking about that, but I want to give a little background on Kyle, because we actually share a lot of roots, and it's just so interesting. We guaranteed 100% interacted with each other probably about 20-something years ago. Would you say that's correct?
Correct, yeah. If we had a time machine, we could prove it, but...
Exactly. And the reason why we say that is that Kyle and I are from this unique part of the country called Northwest Indiana, just outside Chicago. It's called the Region. We are region rats.
That's right.
And we grew up not far from each other. He was born in the hospital of my hometown community. And so, and also I used to work at Borders in Highland, Indiana, which I talk about in Mormon Stories interview, and used to go to Borders all the time.
That was the cultural hub of the region.
Exactly. That was it. It was steel mills, blue collar.
And Borders.
And Borders bookstore. Yes, exactly. So all the intellectuals and the freaks and the geeks all went to Borders books, right. and that was a fun time. Bands would show up there. It was just a good time. Wasn't it just a great, awesome time?
Yeah. And it served coffee. And so that was another important thing. You just didn't, the coffee game in that area was either at like Greek cafes that served everything under the sun, or Borders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and what's also so cool is actually, so you kind of came of age in the 90s. You're a kid of the 90s. Graduated from school, high school in 2003?
2003.
Okay, and so I'm about a decade older than him. So I graduated in 92. But we definitely hung out with some of the same crowds. You were in a punk band, is that correct?
Yes, I was in a punk band. So I had Liberty spikes, and like my hair was as short as it is like here, played drums, and did the scene in the region with some punk rock friends. Punk rock friends.
Now this is the thing. My buddies, the Flying Aarons, you guys were a punk band. I don't think he's heard of you, but I know he's heard of Groovitron.
Groovitron. I have. If you're watching Groovitron, I was one of those 14-year-old kids rocking out at your shows. So
exactly. So you guys over at Groovitron, check it out. And also, of course, my buddies at Pod of Thunder also are familiar with Groovitron as well. Awesome. Favorite rock and roll podcast in the world. Not safe for work. So if you're sensitive to that, don't check it out. So we had so much fun talking last night.
Yeah.
We were hanging out, we had dinner, and we just kind of were comparing notes. We were comparing our similar backgrounds and how we probably interacted with each other. But what brings us so weirdly together is that we're two region rats from just outside of Chicago, and yet Mormonism has played a major, important role in our lives. And this is the other thing, and maybe I didn't mention this earlier, but Kyle is a pastor of a church. So he's an evangelical pastor from the same part of the country I'm from, and he is fascinated in Mormonism, and in particular, the Strangite branch, which is, their main congregations in Burlington, Wisconsin.
Yep, just outside Burlington, yep.
Okay, so that's pretty wild stuff. Now, just a few things. I want to talk about some of the books I have in my collection. My very first book was this from King Strang. I found this at a used bookstore in Michigan, and this was written in the 70s. This is the second edition, written by Robert Weeks. Kind of a nice overview. This is also a book that kind of got a lot of King of Confidence. Not a really good book, would you say?
I'll save my comments.
Okay, so, but here's a book that's definitely commendable. This is a book that has received universal acclaim from many people. God Has Made Us a Kingdom, James Strang and the Midwest Mormons by Vicki Cleverly Speak. And you have to, why don't you give a shout out to Vicki?
Vicki Speak is, I consider her like my academic godmother. From Strang studies. Yeah, she is the GOAT when it comes to Strang. So if you want to know anything about their history, at least in that particular period of time, or if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Strang's Plural Wives, she has the end of the book is devoted to kind of what happens to those women and their experiences after that. Very unique in any of the other books that you're going to read about James.
Yeah, and we got to talk. We're going to talk about a paper you just gave at John Whitmer in a little bit.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I want to just do a little background because, again, like I go on Mormon Stories and it's like, okay, tell us, as an evangelical, how did you get interested in Mormonism? Why don't you just kind of give us the backstory? What hooked you, man? What got you interested in this?
Yeah, so I've been asked that question 1,000 times, and I don't know. I mean, I can't pinpoint a moment. There is one episode that I think I recall when I was a kid that piqued my interest in Mormonism, but my interest in the LDS faith and tradition and history is there's a constellation of answers and experiences, so it's hard to pick one. But if I had to, I remember as a young boy, my grandfather was a engineering professor at Purdue Cal, which was a offshoot of Purdue in the area where we grew up. And in his study, he had a lot of different books, and he was very interested in religion. He comes out of the other Restoration movement, so Campbell, what Sidney Rigdon was before he joined the LDS movement. And he was interested in the study of religion in general. He had this little blue book in his study that I had never really seen before. And I peeled it back and kind of was looking at it, interested, and then hand goes back in, and Grandpa doesn't really want me to have anything to do with that. And so, of course, that's like telling, a 2-year-old, don't press the red button. And so I was like, what is this? And, in our area, we were talking about this last night, it's interesting. It's a very populated area, but there's not a lot of Latter-day Saint presence. Right. And so to meet a Latter-day Saint or come across one in the Chicagoland area, at least at that time, was very rare. Mm-hmm. And so my exposure to Mormonism came from quality sources like Ed Decker's The Godmakers film, which was shown to me in a youth group setting, and Walter Martin's The Kingdom of the Cults. And so that's kind of, I think my experience in the 90s as a child is very typical of an American evangelical youth learning about the cults.
That is so true.
Right?
Actually, when you think about it, Walter Martin's books were really
hugely influential.
Yeah. And then, of course, we had Hookema's book in the 50s.
Yeah, that's right. He wrote on four movements, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can see the
Seventh-day Adventist, Jehovah's Witness, Christian Science, and Mormonism.
Then yes, yep.
And so those are the standard works that a lot of evangelicals would have used to engage Mormonism.
If we had a counter-cult canon, mm-hmm. Walter Martin is a staple. Absolutely. Yeah. And so to learn about the Latter-day Saint faith and tradition from those sources, your audience will know that's probably not the best place to start. But that's where I started, just from my background.
And it's fascinating because, we were talking about this last night, just to kind of get back to the background of us, is that we're from the Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana. In Northwest Indiana is more like we are more Chicago than Indiana, but Chicago don't want to have nothing with us. No. We are in Indiana, but Indiana don't want to have nothing to do with us.
They literally call us rats.
Yeah, we're the region rats. Exactly, we're rats. So that's where we're in. But you're right. So I just recall my dad had a tire shop on Klein Avenue in Highland, Indiana, mm-hmm. right? And just down the street in Griffith, Indiana, was a LDS Word. That's where it was located.
The only one in the area. And you're talking 500,000 people.
Yep.
So it was, you just didn't come across them.
Right.
I had more independent fundamentalist Baptists come and knock on my door than LDS missionaries. I don't think we ever had LDS missionaries come to our door that I can remember.
And I would say Jehovah's Witnesses probably have a bigger presence than the Mormons do, wouldn't you say?
Yep. So all that to say, my experience was limited.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually meet a Latter-day Saint until, I moved away from the area, and I came across 2 missionaries. And they had the same book that Grandpa told me not to have anything to do with. I'm like, oh, here it's people that read the book, and they look like salesmen, so maybe they're selling the book. And I remember they were talking to an elderly woman who was double checking her watch, she doesn't really have time for this. And I kind of stayed behind and kept side glancing, and one of them caught my eye, and so I knew, hey, we're going to have this interaction. And they came to me and they told me the whole introduction like what is the Book of Mormon?
And how old were you at this time?
I was in my early 20s.
Early 20s, okay.
20s, yeah. So it was the whole introduction of like Christ coming to the New World, preaching the same gospel, calling disciples, Joseph Smith's restoration, all of it. And it was, frankly, it was overwhelming. Like it was just like this inundation of like, what in the world? I had so many questions, but not enough time.
Sure.
And they're like, hey, you should call the missionaries and have them come over. And so over the next few years, I would call missionaries and have them come over and introduce me to this new message. And I frustrated their efforts. I was never converted, probably to their chagrin. But what I did learn in that experience is what I had been told by my tribe about Latter-day Saints did not match what Latter-day Saints were telling me about their own faith. And so I had a dilemma.
Sure.
Is there truth in the middle? Is the Walter Martin Hugema at Decker world right? Or are these essentially representatives of the church correct? And that kind of like honed my focus of like, what's the truth here?
Yeah.
And the first book that was recommended to me for an academic treatment of the Latter-day Saint history was No Man Knows My History. Okay. So you can imagine I'm off to a wonky start.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and so when you first engaged Joseph Smith through No Man Knows My History, what was it like reading that book for the first time and kind of reading about Joseph from maybe a more secular viewpoint?
It was, yeah, so I think I was here, I'll be frank, I wanted what Walter Martin told me about Latter-day Saint beliefs to be true. And so reading that book was really confirming a lot of he was a fraud, there's this magic stuff going on. I had not come across that at all. Like, oh, of course this is wrong. But at the same time, there was a tinge of like synchronizing of concerns that Joseph Smith had and like I had about denominationalism, infighting. And that it made Joseph a bit human, if that, I don't know how else to describe it. And he has a concern that I shared was, well, how do we know? It was basically like religious authority, spiritual authority,
right.
What is truth, these types of things. And so that it set me off on a new kind of trajectory of like, okay, well, let's go back. I want to see the notes on this. Like, show me the work, right?
Yeah.
I want to see, and then the next biography I wrote. I did not write a biography. I read was Rough Stone Rolling.
Okay.
And that really got me into the kind of the academic side of the LDS.
You know, and that's fascinating. I've read Rough Stone Rolling probably at least 3 times. Love that book. It could be, as far as I'm concerned, double the size of that thing. I'll keep on reading. I just love that book. And I love No Man Knows My History. But the one thing I didn't like about No Man Knows My History is that Fawn Brody just assumed that Joseph was a con man, and he knew that he was a con man, and he was just making the stuff up. And I was like, I don't know what would motivate. No, let me rephrase this here. I know what it's like to be a believer, right? And I also know that when I read Joseph Smith, I think of him more as a believer and not as a con man. That it's a complicated mix, and so I thought that Bushman kind of fleshed it out a little bit because he's a faithful person, you know, and so he kind of was able to give a faithful interpretation to. So I think the 2 books actually complement each other very well.
Yeah. Just a little side tangent. The reason I pointed over here is because you asked me earlier about the King of Confidence. And, the King of Confidence is essentially writing about James Strang from the presupposition that he is a con man.
Exactly.
So you got the King of Confidence.
Good point.
And so this is No Man Knows My History. Of James Strang.
Okay, got it.
Kind of how I would approach that.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
I like that observation you made. That's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it was the concerns that Joseph had is what kind of really got me interested in the restoration project. And the more you learn about the history, the more fascinating it gets. People ask me, like, why are you interested in Mormonism or the LDS story? Like, well, you apparently don't know it. right? How could you not be interested in
yeah,
it, right? Like,
absolutely.
so, that's a silly question to me at this point. Obviously, I'm not Latter-day Saint. I don't believe that Joseph's solutions for the problems that were then dividing churches in his day were true, or I don't know. I disagree with how he went about fixing things, but the fact that we shared the concern
Yes.
is what hooked me.
Well, and this is the thing, folks. In one sense, both Kyle and I come from a Restorationist background. I come from I was kind of, Calvinist was my lineage, but charismatic renewal that my parents got involved in before I was born, okay, that's a Restorationist movement. But you were born into a Restorationist church. You attended in my hometown of Munster, Indiana, Southside Christian Church, which is a Stone Campbellite movement church, right?
Yeah. It's got a complicated lineage as well, but you could follow it all the way back to Stone Campbell.
And that's the thing. That's why I think, in one sense, Joseph resonates with both of us.
Right.
Because
we understand the project.
We understand what
Yes.
And I even tell people, I said, when Joseph goes and when we hear the whole first vision story fleshed out, and God's kind of given the admonition, they're these philosophies of men, and condemns all these groups. And I'm like, there's a lot of stuff I agree with there. That in one sense, I agree that the state of Protestant America was very needed a restoration in one sense.
Right. You come at like philosophies of men, for example.
Yeah.
The thing that pops into my mind is, well, no creed but Christ. So that was the solution of that movement. Like, let's just collapse the creeds. Where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we're silent, right? And so the authority structure for that restoration movement terminated on the Old and New Testament, but the authority structure in the LDS movement grew beyond Scripture, right? It's an incorporation of the Book of Mormon. It's incorporation of modern or latter-day prophecy through a prophet, canonized and collected in Doctrine and Covenants, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it's obviously two different solutions, but addressing the same problem. Like, how do we get back to this one faith, one Lord, one baptism that we're supposed to be as New Testament believers?
Yeah. So I think that's in one sense why, like, I remember as a little kid, I was like, man, the Bible ain't working anymore. People don't believe in the Bible, and our world is getting secular, and everything's, and this is early 80s, right? And I was like, we almost need a new Bible, is what I thought, that addresses our modern ills of our society. And then I hear about this other young boy that encountered Scripture, that addressed the ills of its time and addressed many of the concerns. So that resonated with me, man. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And it's I don't know. It's interesting. I find that interesting that it was kind of our origin story.
Yeah, so we have similar origin stories. We come from like the same background, same backyard, and yet. Do you think there's actually a third person from Northwest Indiana that's like us? Because I think we're probably it. Wouldn't you say?
I mean, if you're out there, please let us know.
Please let us know.
We'd love to get together with you at Shoop's.
Shoop's Hamburgers,
is the best hamburger place, and you know that already. Of
course.
Whoever you are, but unless you like mine are done, and then.
No, we won't be doing it by our done.
Yeah, no, I don't know. We might be it. I don't know.
So maybe we'll do House of Pizza or Aurelio's Pizza.
Aurelio's,
Okay.
yeah.
So that's what we'll do. So yes, since we're two unique birds, obviously we established that. Now, before we move on to the group that most fascinates you, was there anything about Joseph Smith in the early days of the Restoration that you wanted to talk about?
Well, it's your interview. We talk about whatever you want to talk about. I mean, there's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
I'm really fascinated in doctrine and doctrine making. We could talk about.
Well, that's the thing. So, because for a lot of people, the story of Mormonism is that you have the martyrdom, and then you have Utah, and then you have the main branch, and that's it. And what's so fascinating is the story of the people that did not go to Utah. But they had everything, the development of Joseph Smith and the doctrines and everything like this, and King Follett and all the polygamy and all these things that were going on up to 1844. There were also other people that did not follow Brigham Young that stayed back. And I think probably as we talk about the development of doctrine, we should also talk about this gentleman named James Strang.
Sure.
And let's talk about a different path of the Restoration.
Sure, yeah.
That didn't go to Utah.
Yeah, well, so there's a lot that didn't. But when you're talking about the development of doctrine, the seeds were planted before Joseph Smith's assassination in 1844 for somebody like James Strang to come along. And what I mean by that is, if you have to imagine doctrine making was a critical element to early Mormonism, especially as it surrounds issues like authority or gathering to Zion. We're trying to retrieve or restore the ancient order of things and pull back from eventually the premortal existence, but from the garden to the new garden that's supposed to be coming, right?
Okay.
And so almost like year by year, you could see doctrine developing. So depending on when you joined the Latter-day Saint movement, you might have signed up for one thing, and then 4 or 5 years later, the church has changed. Not just in like physical location. Okay, we start in Kirkland, now we split the church and we're in Missouri, but then we get kicked out of Missouri. But also, and also like ecclesiastical structure. So it was a very simple, flat, all things done by common consent early on, and then it becomes kind of the priesthood hierarchy. You get the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthood, and you get 70s and apostles. It's just growing. If you join the church early in the early 1830s, it looks very different than in the early 1840s.
Yeah.
So I find it interesting that a lot of people that join James Strang are those that have been around the movement, and they prefer the old school. Some of them even called it primitive Mormonism. Like they're more interested in seer stones and plates. They're anti-polygamy. They want monogamy. They're still lured by the call of restoration of the ancient order of things and the gathering place Zion. They're very aware of what they called the Lamanite mission. So they want to preach the restored gospel to the indigenous peoples whom they believe descend from the tribes of Israel. So if you want to start with James' story, you can't start in 1844. You have to start in the 1830s.
Exactly.
Right? So 1844, famously, Joseph Smith is assassinated, as well as his brother Hiram, and Sidney Rigdon is not well liked. And so we have a complete removal in a matter of hours of the first presidency, or the top three. And there's a succession crisis. John Hamer has a great book, Scattering of the Saints, and it's got a visual timeline, really well done. I think actually edited it. It's got contributions from Vicky. Vicky has a chapter, and Vicky Speak does. So everybody goes everywhere. But the thing that's fascinating to me about that story is this man, James Strang.
Right. And now, let's talk, before we talk about the succession crisis and all this other stuff with James, why don't you give some background on James Strang?
Sure.
Who was James Strang?
Yeah, so James Strang, he comes from a French background, immigrants, I think maybe 2 or 3 generations before him. He's born in Cayuga County, New York in 1813. So he grows up in the same region as Joseph Smith, not quite contemporaries, right? Joseph Smith's older than him. James Strang says he has kind of an ordinary childhood, but if you read his diary, part of it was ciphered, actually, and so one of his sons deciphered it. He had incredible ambitions. He wanted to marry the Queen of England. He thought the country was going to be broken up in a civil war, and he wanted to stand up and take power and to lead us back to unity. He was a temperance lecturer. He was a preacher. His family were Baptists. He was a postmaster and a newspaperman and a lawyer. So he's a very intelligent guy. And he ends up in the Wisconsin territory in 1843 by invitation from some of his in-laws, I believe. He marries a woman named Mary, and her family's starting to move out there. And this family knows another Smith family unrelated to the Smiths, who are Latter-day Saints.
Okay.
And this is his first introduction kind of to the LDS faith tradition.
1843.
1843.
Wow.
Super late as far as like the early story is concerned. He's converted and baptized in Nauvoo in February of 1844. He says by Joseph Smith and is given a blessing by Hiram Smith. I don't think we can verify that,
Okay.
but that's what he claims.
That's what he claimed. Okay.
And if you know your history, around 1843, 1844, it's a pretty tumultuous time. We know what's coming in 1844, the summer. But there's also a group called the Council of 50 that's meeting to discuss what are we going to do to bring about the kingdom of God on earth, while at the same time stopping all of this Gentile opposition persecution. I am convinced James was likely aware of those conversations, although he's not obviously a member, and he proposes to Joseph Smith, hey, why don't we move up to the Wisconsin territory? And apparently that conversation did take place, but James receives a letter shortly after Joseph Smith is murdered called the Letter of Appointment, which, if you read it, states very implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly, that Joseph Smith has appointed James Strang to be the successor of the church should Joseph Smith die.
Okay.
And that's his kind of the beginning of his claim to the succession.
Is this an authentic letter?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
I believe it was forged. I know that if you there's a lot of reasons we can go into. I've seen it. I've seen the letter. It's currently housed in the Beinecke Library at Yale.
Okay.
So I've actually did the stupid thing of I took a selfie with it on a dare. But I've seen it, I've held it with my own hands, and I know that doesn't mean anything more than just a subjective experience, but it doesn't resemble Joseph Smith's signature, his handwriting, nor any of the scribes that he used at that time.
Okay.
But here's the tricky part about that letter. It's fairly indisputed that the back of the letter is authentic. It has a stamp from Nauvoo, with a date, June 19th, I believe, and there's a little speck that got wedged in the stamp, and all of the letters that were outgoing that day had that exact same speck. That night they cleaned it, and then the 20th they don't have that speck.
Oh wow.
So that's James Strang's argument. How in the world could the letter be a forgery if the stamp is authentic? And I think there's explanations for why or how it could still be, but that would take up the rest of the interview.
No, that's really interesting to think, to even speculate about that, because one thing you could say in favor of the letter is that what you had said, it's implicit, not explicit. And if you were going to, I'm going to do devil's advocate here. If I was going to forge something, I would make it really clear that I'm the guy, not more explicitly, implicitly. Would that be an argument in favor of its authenticity?
I think so, and it's another argument in favor of its authenticity is that because it's so implicit, the letter is merely Joseph Smith desiring to establish a stake in the Wisconsin territory, not that the entire gathering of the LDS tradition would come to him. But that is not how James interpreted it or even argued it. And this is something that I don't think gets talked about much in this part of Strang's story, that is not his primary argument for authority.
Right.
That's not his primary argument. His primary argument for authority is he was ordained by an angel at precisely the exact moment that Joseph Smith was assassinated, or at least in that hour. Right. Angel comes, anoints him with oil, to this high priesthood, he says, and then he's gone. Now,
so what's the name of the angel? Do we have a name?
We don't have a name for the angel.
Don't have a name, okay.
No. And there's two accounts of that vision. One is that an angel came, and two, that there were many angels, and then one angel stepped forward and ordained him. Okay. But that's as far as I know, those are the only two accounts, and they're both written by him.
Okay. Interesting.
So that's his primary argument. I was ordained by an angel, and that's important if you're thinking about like the grand story of the Restoration, as Joseph Smith tells it. Angels are really important, and so here's what I mean earlier when I said like early Latter-day Saints were attracted to James because I want God to appoint the next prophet by an angel, and here's this guy saying that it's true, and he's got a letter apparently to back it up, and so he begins to win converts in that way. But that's not the...
So we have the angelic appointment. We have this letter of appointment. We have... Maybe just start talking about... So now we have this guy who's making a claim, and by the way, he was a serious contender for being the successor to Joseph Smith, because there are many people that moved up to Wisconsin, and they were engaging him, including William Smith. Even John Bennett makes an appearance. I mean,
George
maybe
Adams,
just talk about how
yeah.
he was kind of viewed at the time during this period of time.
Yeah, so I hesitate to say he's a serious contender, but he is a serious rival to Brigham Young.
Okay, serious
rival.
rival.
I would put it like that, yeah.
Okay.
And there was a lot. I think Vicky Speak estimates somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 Latter-day Saints would come in and out of his church at some point. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And compared to the total population of the Latter-day Saint movement in the United States at that time. Doesn't sound like a lot of people today, but back then that was. So yeah, he begins to gather his following in a spot called Voree, which was Spring Prairie in Wisconsin, outside of Burlington, modern day Burlington, and he immediately tries to convince the 12 that he's been appointed. And as you can imagine, the 12 rejected him. He was excommunicated. And so a year after his excommunication, I want to say, I think his excommunication was like in October 1844, and then by that following fall, 1845, James has big news.
Okay.
He has discovered plates.
Okay. So now we have another data point.
Another data point, yeah.
That, so we have these other things, these claims that are being made. Now we have a direct parallel to the prophet.
Many parallels.
Right, we have many
parallels. Yeah, and that's one of the things James is doing. Whether you believe him or not, what you can't deny is that there are parallels. Now these parallels can be, incidental, they could be coincidental, they could be fabricated, but there are parallels, right? So James Strang gets the Urim and Thummim. James Strang is appointed by an angel. Like James Strang, even in the letter of appointment itself, the language is lending itself to this like baton passing from one prophet to another. Joseph says he's taken up in the whirlwinds of Elijah. And so you've got this idea of like Elijah is going to die. He's going to pass the prophetic torch to Elisha, right?
Okay.
So yeah, there's a lot of parallels going on here. Yeah, and the plates one is a big one, and this wins a lot of converts.
And let's just talk a little bit about that. You mentioned he had the Urim and Thummim. Was it a seer stone or was it the spectacles?
He doesn't.
He just refers to as
Urim and Thummim.
Okay, and so and talk a little bit about describe the plates and maybe the process of translation.
Yeah, so he uses Urim and Thummim to locate the plates.
Oh, okay.
I don't think he uses them to translate them.
Interesting.
If I'm mistaken, somebody please correct me. And the location of the plates are under a tree at a location called the Hill of Promise, which is in Voree, which is in Wisconsin, which is where Joseph, through the letter of appointment, ostensibly told the church to gather. And the plates they're three plates, double-sided. There's text on some of them, writing on one or two of them, if I remember correctly. And it's a very short translation. James Strang publishes it in the fall of 1845. And it's from a man named Raja Manshu of Arito, I think a play on Voree.
Okay.
And this is kind of a warrior figure, a leader among the Nephites, and he's making a prediction that he's going to die, or that in the future, in this area, a future prophet's going to die, but then in this exact location in Vorito, or Voree, Hill of Promise, another prophet was going to rise in his place. And so if you're looking at it in like the timeline of the Book of Mormon, and that's where you want to put it, you can imagine the Lamanites are closing in on Mormon and Moroni, and they go past Raja, and they kill him on their way to get to. So this is like a last, trust me, this is going to happen. He dies, and then they finally get to Mormon and Moroni, and then there's the end of the Nephites, right? So that's where these plates, where I think James is trying to situate this in the grand narrative of the
And
Book
just
of Mormon.
so I know, was this called the Hill of Promise before, or was it named by James as
the Hill of Promise is near the banks of the White River in Wisconsin, and it was by an old mine. I think it was a lead mine. Okay. And this hill is there. The followers of James Strang today own that property.
Okay.
So if it's private property, it's held in trust, but they own that property for a number of reasons. But one of them is it's obviously very significant to them. This is kind of where the next chapter in the reception of ancient revelation is coming to us from.
Just real quick, just to clarify, because Joseph Smith gave the name Hill Cumorah to Hill Cumorah. The Hill of Promise, was that the name?
I believe the Hill of Promise is in the translation. I'm not.
Oh, okay, so that's where the name. Okay,
yeah.
so that's okay. So
it could be. Again, if I'm wrong.
Okay, great. That's good. So again, this is a very interesting parallel because you have your own Hill Cumorah in Wisconsin where plates were found.
Correct. But not. So I don't want viewers or listeners to imagine like these plates were like stacked, and then there's like some that are going to be locked away until a future time. Like, no, there was like 3. They were tiny, little. You could hold them in your hand as far as like facsimiles.
So it'd be more like the Kinderhook plates.
Something similar to that.
Okay.
Yeah, as far as like size and material are concerned.
Okay.
The thing that was different with Strang's approach, though, was whereas Joseph had witnesses to the plates, James had witnesses who dug up the plates.
Okay.
So James says that the Urim and Thummim show him the location of the plates buried beneath the tree on the Hill of Promise, and then instead of digging them up himself, he goes and he gets people as witnesses to come and they dig it up, and they're the ones that find it.
Okay, that's.
And I believe, yeah. So that's a
okay. Wow.
That's a difference, but a similarity at the same time.
Yeah, and of course, we as outsiders, we look at the claims of the Restoration, and how are we to differentiate between Joseph Smith's claims and James Strang's claims in the sense that, why is Joseph valid but James isn't valid? Those are the questions we would bring to the table as outsiders as well, wouldn't you say?
Sure, and those questions are answered back earlier, I believe, in the succession. Like, was what was the way forward for the Restoration movement at the moment of Joseph Smith's death? And you really, at that point in time, you've got one primary trajectory and then a ton of offshoots, right? So it depends on. Again, I think if you were more interested in angels and plates and Urim and Thummim and those types of things, and there was one woman, Strangite, who said, "Hey, if God's going to appoint one prophet in one way, then shouldn't we expect him to appoint the next prophet in the exact same way? That's why I followed him." Another man, Thompson, this is where the Thompson came from, we were talking about earlier. He said, "I go for the man with the tools." In other words, the Urim and the Thummim. Right. So these are really convincing arguments for his followers. The bulk of the people, though, those are not convincing arguments. And for them, they're looking at these similarities and they're like, "Come on."
Okay.
These are a little too convenient. They're a little too on the nose. So probably the same questions we have today were the exact same questions that were being asked back then.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah. Wow. And of course, just a little bit more, we talked a little bit about, but he was a pretty well-educated person too. He was much more educated than Joseph Smith.
I would say so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a school teacher at some point as well.
So he's, and I didn't realize, I wish I knew more about James Strang than I did. Last night we were talking, man, I should have known that. And I probably read it at some point, I just didn't retain the information. But he's a really, just a fascinating guy.
Absolutely fascinating.
And so like I tell people, I fell in love with Joseph reading No Man Knows My History and Rough Stone Rolling.
Yeah.
How do you engage James Strang just from a scholarly level, but also as being an evangelical?
Yeah, so it's a part of the LDS story.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not making an authority statement. I'm not making a truth statement. I'm making a historical statement. This is part of the LDS story, and it's just a really fascinating part of the story for me. Not only for the things that we just talked about, but as the story progresses, James establishes essentially a theocratic proto-communistic society on an island in Lake Michigan, which is we grew up very close to. So like Lake Michigan has a little place in my heart. And then he holds a coronation ceremony, claiming that he would be the king of the kingdom of God on earth as kind of a viceroy until Christ would descend and usher in the millennium. Whoa, that's that's interesting too.
Well, and of course, this is another parallel with Joseph because he was crowned king of the world as well.
Yes, but Strang follows. He really takes that trajectory forward.
So builds
upon it. Yeah,
okay.
Yes. So where's the connection? Like, how would James have gotten that information? Those types of things. What you're referring to is the Council of 50, which not everybody was privy to, but. As far as I'm aware, at least 5, if not 6, members of the Council of 50 at some point were a part of James's movement or even part of James's leadership. And I think probably George Adams is the prominent figure there. George Adams stays with Strang for quite a while, and his story is crazy as well. It ends up in JWHA, Israel.
Oh, wow.
And so we don't have time to go there.
That's for the next interview.
Yeah, there you go. We'll talk about George Adams. He's crazy. Anyway, well, he's not crazy, but the story's crazy. But yeah, so that's how I think he would have gotten that information.
Okay. And then I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of his theological developments, a little bit more about the history. But James C., let's just talk a little bit about Bennett. John Bennett makes an appearance.
Yes, he does.
James Strang, and kind of has an impact on the movement, would you say?
Yes, he does. Okay. Yeah, so John Bennett is a notorious figure in LDS history. He is, I forget the exact rank, but Lieutenant General of the Legion of Nauvoo, correct me if I'm wrong. He was mayor. He had something to do with the establishment of what would have been like a university in Nauvoo. He climbs the ranks, social ranks and ecclesiastical ranks very, very quickly. And he's not a man of character. I think that's pretty well established. Mm-hmm. He's given over to alcohol and whatever you think about the spiritual wifery system, even by its own standards or rules, he was breaking them. And so he gets kicked out 43 in Nauvoo. I don't remember. I'm not as familiar with that part of the history. But the second he hears about James Strang's claims, he writes James a letter, and it's very flattering. It's very. He's begging for an invitation to be restored. And James, I don't know why, he said basically like, "Come on." Mm-hmm. And with John Bennett, I think you could probably draw a tie to a few things. One, Strang starts an organization called the Order of the Illuminati that has kind of a maybe what they're doing with that is they're trying to restore Freemasonry to its purest form, which was going on in Nauvoo as well. So he's following that trajectory, and I think John Bennett helps in that area. But more importantly, if I had to pinpoint where does polygamy enter the Strang story, it's probably a John Bennett as well.
Okay.
Because James is a vehement anti-polygamist in the very earliest days of his movement. And one of his arguments, he basically had a threefold argument. One, why are you going to follow a prophet, being Brigham Young, who wasn't ordained by an angel or wasn't appointed like I was? Two, why do you want to go into the wilds? You're going to die in that desert. You can come to the fertile dales of Wisconsin. Three, do you really want to go follow a group of people that are going to practice polygamy? We're not going to practice polygamy. He has a very famous line in one of his newspapers. He's considered his opinion on this matter unchangeable. And so that was really attractive to people that were like, I'm sold on the Restoration Movement, not sold on the plural marriage, but here's a guy who says he's not going to do plural marriage. I'm going this way. And it probably wouldn't surprise people to know that most of the people that went to Strang because of his, pro-monogamy views are going to end up eventually in the reorganization.
Absolutely.
The reorganization, right. In fact, like the seedbed of the reorganized church is probably disaffected Strangites.
Yeah, that's very true.
So John Bennett, he's in the movement actually pretty briefly. He gets excommunicated by a council, by Strang, for the same reasons, like anger, alcoholism, womanizing, those types of things.
And Bennett's such an interesting character because this dude, even though he writes this book blasting Joseph Smith and Mormonism and all this kind of stuff, he's years later going after Joseph Smith III, saying, "Hey, I want to reach out to you. I want to be included in your group." And it's crazy. This guy never could quite let go of Mormonism. He was always trying to find an opportunity.
No, there's no person like him that I can think of in the LDS story. He will not quit.
No, he won't. Yeah. And so it's just a fact because he's often viewed as an enemy. But it was interesting how even after he did his expose on it, his life still was Mormonism still played a role in his life. And he kind of wanted to.
And when was the expose published? Was that 43?
I think
it was shortly after his excommunication. You're talking within a year or two. Yeah. He's begging James for a position for a seat at the table.
Yeah, even after all that he did. Yeah. And it's an interesting thing. And so this is the other thing too is, he of course we have the plates. Okay, so we have that short translation that he did, but then we also have more scripture.
Yes.
Coming out of the movement. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So this is an 1848 edition of what's called the Book of the Law of the Lord. So these are pretty rare. There's not too many of them.
No, I'm assuming that was rebound.
No. This is an 1848 edition. So this was printed in Burlington, or at the current church there in Spring Prairie. 1848. But you can see on the title page, and maybe we could put a picture up there later, but printed by command of the King at the Royal Press, St. James, ARI is the date that it was printed. And as far as we can tell, that means something like the date of the first year of the reign of King James.
So you're saying this is this is an astonishing...
I'm sorry, did I say 1849? No, 1948.
Oh, 1948.
Yeah. Holy cow, huge correction. Yes, holy cow, yes, please. Yeah. These are still extremely rare. 1948. Okay. 1948. But the Book of the Law of the Lord is translated in the winter-ish, because it's hard to put that timeline together. Maybe if you ever have Vicky speak on, she can help with this better.
Sure.
But in the winter of 1849 to 50, and the Book of the Law of the Lord, most of it, James says, is the text that was kept in the Ark of the Covenant.
Okay.
And that anything that we have in the Torah that has anything to do with the law is derivative of this. So the Ten Commandments, derivative of this. Ceremonial law, those types of things, derivative of this. This is the core of the law. But there's also commentary that James Strang gives and revelations that were given to him as he's translating this document. Okay. So this is more, it's not the Book of the Law of the Lord, it's a library that contains the Book of the Law of the Lord. It's probably a better way to think about it.
Okay.
And one of the more famous revelations that James gives is the celebration of his coronation is supposed to be played out in perpetuity. So July 8th, 1850, he's crowned king. There's a revelation in this book that says, hey, we're going to celebrate that every single year.
Okay, now let me see that real quick. This is so fascinating to me. Because I was actually talking to a scholar, and we were discussing this, and that he gives number counts in here.
Yeah.
Of like at the end of it, he'll give a number count, like
just like a lawyer would at that.
So that's what a lawyer would be doing.
Yep.
So is that more of a because I thought maybe he was familiar with like biblical numerology or Kabbalah, nothing like that.
Personally, I don't think so. I think what he's doing is he's following a common practice of legal writers in his day. I could be wrong. That's just my stab at it. I don't know if he ever said why he did that.
Okay, because I just thought maybe he had some knowledge of of numbers in scriptures, and I was just kind of that's another unique function of the book is that he has that in there, and it's like a book of Revelations, but it's also the more old records that he's kind of being revealed. So it's kind of a mesh of maybe like the Book of Mormon and Doctrines and Covenants put together, which is kind of.
There's no narrative.
No narrative. Okay.
Yeah. So it's law, it's commentary on the law, and it's new revelations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, the other thing too is what makes this movement so unique is that it's about the only Sabbatarian church in the Restoration.
Correct.
What was that because of he wanted to go back to the?
Yeah. It's in the Book of the Law of the Lord. Yeah,
what's his reasoning?
Part of the retrieval of the ancient oral things is in the fourth commandment is you shouldn't break the Sabbath, you should keep it. And so James read that as he followed the idea, if I remember correctly, that Constantine. So this is kind of mythological history here for Christian history, but Constantine moved it. He moved the day of worship. And we need to retrieve that. So the Sabbatarianism was really popular in the 19th century. The Seventh-day Adventist movement came out of it, but actually it started, if I'm not mistaken, prior to Joseph's day and during Joseph's day with the Seventh-day Baptists.
Right.
So it was a kind of a Baptistic retrieval of the Sabbath. And there was a whole to-do. In newspapers around Joseph Smith's time, like one guy was like, hey, if the Constitution means anything, we should be able to celebrate the Sabbath when we want to. Like, this is a really big debate. The side of it that comes down for James is Sabbatarianism. We're not going to celebrate the Lord's Day on Sunday, we're going to celebrate on Saturday.
Yeah.
And it's something they practice till this day.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's just... And you're right, because it actually, in one sense, it predates the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because Ellen White and her ideas didn't come across till 1860. Do we have any knowledge that his writings on the Seventh-day or on Sabbatarianism may have influenced any other movements like the Seventh-day Adventists or anything?
I have no clue.
Okay.
That's a really interesting question. And the only thing I can think of outside of his own writings is I think he had a school of prophets on Beaver Island. If I'm not mistaken, he commissioned at least one student to write on Sabbatarianism. So I think he's smart in the fact that when he's going to do doctrine making, he's going to distribute the workload, essentially. And so part of his school of the prophets is like students crafting essays and then like feeding them back to the prophet or the teacher. And if I'm not mistaken, Sabbatarianism is one of the topics.
Okay, yeah, I know. I mean, what's so cool too is the privilege that you and I have. We were talking about it last night. We are unique as evangelicals engaging the Restoration, in that we are having conversations with people in the Restoration that other evangelicals will never have. And one of the beautiful things about, like when I was at John Whitmer, I got to meet some members of the church. Of course, people know about John Hychek as well. He's also part of this movement broadly as well. And then if you have the church that you're associated with within Wisconsin. I just wanted maybe you could just talk a little bit about maybe the people of James Strang today.
Some of the kindest people I've ever met in my life. Salt of the earth.
Yeah.
Very gentle, very, very. They're very welcoming of me. Not at first, but I don't blame them.
Yeah.
What do you care? What are you interested in? And to be in their corner a little bit. The Strangites have been beaten up by the Brighamites and the Josephites for decades.
Yeah.
So outsiders they're welcome, but it's a high fence you have to climb.
Sure.
But once you do, it's just a low fence after that, to being welcomed in friendship. I did my dissertation on one of their prominent leaders after Strang's death, named Wingfield Watson. And they invited me to speak before their entire congregation about my research. And still to this day, I consider it one of the greatest privileges I've ever had in my life. And I got letters, like cards, for a couple weeks after, women, or people from all over, because the Strangites are scattered. Most of them are in Wisconsin, but they're anywhere from like New Mexico to Louisiana, Missouri. But they were sending me cards, like thanking me, and like. I told them what I found. I didn't jump on that to tickle ears. Like, here's what I found. Like, here's the history. But they were very kind. There's one man in particular, Bill Shepard, I'm sure listeners may know.
Who was a guest on Gospel Tangents.
Who was a guest on Gospel Tangents, yep. He's one of the kindest men I've ever met in my life. Very sweet. We try to keep up in contact with each other by phone call. He was the one that pointed me to Wingfield Watson. I've visited him a couple of times. They're just great people. And it's interesting to me, presently that branch, which is the largest, that branch has a pretty healthy, so as a pastor, you look at like the demographics of a church. Yeah. They have healthy demographics as far as age is concerned. Okay. I don't think, people are like, when is it going to be the candle moment for the Strangite church? I don't think it's happening in our lifetime.
Oh, so, okay.
So I think that church will continue. And from their perspective, I think they would see that as evidence of a kind of a remnant. They're waiting for the third prophet. And I know that might sound strange to Latter-day viewers. They're waiting for the third prophet.
Okay, now let's okay, I love third prophet. Is this going to be a resurrected person, or is this going to be a new prophet?
I don't know. So I cannot speak to their beliefs today or presently. Right. I don't know. What I can say is I can give you Wingfield Watson's perspective on this, because we're talking about a niche of a niche of a niche question.
Sure.
Who's the third prophet? Okay, well, according to Wingfield Watson, he went through a couple of ideas. The first idea was because God ordained James Strang at the moment of Joseph Smith's death, God had ordained the third prophet at the moment of James Strang's death, which was 1856.
Okay.
Where is that prophet? And so he spent years wondering, when is he going to come forward? He has to be out there. The church can't be without a prophet. Where is he? After a while, when he realized, like, that's probably not going to happen, he then shifted to a second idea of the resurrection of Joseph Smith and James Strang to be the final Latter-day Prophets, kind of like is it Moses and Elijah?
Sure. Oh, so maybe like the two witnesses type
like the two witnesses, right? Oh. So Watson believed, and it's hard to pull all these things together in his letters, right? But he believed, as far as I understand what he's trying to say, is that Joseph Smith and James Strang would resurrect in the moments preceding Christ's return, and that would be the final third prophet. Now, whether any person in that church believes that today, or is like, that's Watson, that's hogwash. Like, I have people in my theological tribe that'll say something like, that guy's full of it. I don't believe that. Yeah. Don't know. But that's one guy's perspective. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating stuff. Man, I just love having finding stuff like this out. This is one of the reasons I do this show, folks, is just remember, I'm just doing this for me. You're along for the ride. I'm here to have this conversation, just happen to be filming it. Wow, that's so cool. And we're getting back to the people of James Strang. And of course, I want to tell people too, if you've watched my part 3 of my interview with John Hamer, we do discuss some of the various prophets, of the claimants during the succession crisis. That's a really good interview if people want to have an overview of that time period as well. But before we get to the people, I do actually want to talk about one more parallel, because we have another parallel we have is Joseph Smith runs for president. James Strang runs for state senate.
Legislature. Well, he wins.
But he wins. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so that's a parallel. And then we have the martyrdom. So we have a martyrdom. So in many sense, like people say, like on some level, he is Joseph's successor. If you're just going by parallels, and of course we can go and say, well, yeah, but he was just following the pattern. Well, I don't think James Strang's pattern was. And at the very end, I'm going to get assassinated. That wasn't part of his plan. But it's an interesting parallel that happened to him as well.
Yeah, he's assassinated in the summer, also of 1856, almost to the anniversary of almost to the 6th anniversary of his coronation. I think it happened a day after. Okay. And he's assassinated by a Gentile and a disaffected member of Strang's community, which they pejoratively called as pseudos, as in like pseudo-believers, false believers. And he's assassinated on a dock in cooperation with the United States Navy, by the way. Yep. Which is that's one of the thing I want to do next is I want to double click on what in the world was the Navy doing helping assassinate an American citizen. So look for that in a couple of years, maybe.
Yeah, well, just remember, they were rivals with Mackinac Island, too.
I think there was East Coast, West Coast thing going on in Lake Michigan. Accused of piracy, of polygamy, all these things. Yeah. But anyway, he's assassinated in 1856. He doesn't die immediately. He's taken back to Voree. He does not name a successor. I think maybe he tries to at the very end, but can't get it out. And then his last words were essentially, hey, every man take care of his family and scatter. See, the exact opposite project of gathering, he says scatter, because if you scatter, they're not going to be able to persecute you as bad. Oh. And those are kind of the marching orders for him. You've got the first presidency of that church is now gone, and you only have a handful of apostles left. And then there becomes a succession debate, which we could go into, but who's going to lead the church? And the book of the law of the Lord forbids any kind of upward appointing. An apostle can't appoint a prophet. Prophets can only appoint apostles. And so there's only apostles. God's the only one that can do it. But as one apostle dies and another dies, the hierarchy shrinks, right, until you've only got a presiding high priest as the leader, who's Wingfield Watson. So it contracts in its leadership as well.
Okay, so what is the highest office in the church today?
I believe it's presiding high priest.
Presiding high priest, okay.
Presiding high priest.
Now, this is what's so interesting, too, is that you have a people. See, not only there's a parallel with Joseph Smith, but we also have a parallel with a people that's been persecuted, a peculiar people, a people that are, in one sense, still probably the echoes of PTSD, of trauma that was done to them, making its way to this day. And just to think about how, in one sense, you have a church that's birthed out of tragedy. You have 2 prophets that were killed. And and you're just kind of moving along, but in one sense, you could understand why they would view themselves as a remnant, as a persecuted people, And that's kind of how I could see how they would see that. How do they view themselves in the big scheme of things? I imagine they believe they're going to play a major role in the end of days, and that the restoration of their church, the restoration of their people, is something that will be coming forth.
Yeah, again, I don't want to speak to their present beliefs. I'd let them kind of describe what they say, but if they're on the trajectory that leaders after James Strang said, doctrinally speaking, it's probably fairly accurate. I think they would see themselves as remnant and in anticipation.
Remnant and in anticipation. Wow, fascinating stuff. It's great having these conversations. It's great having these interactions. Not only you and I talking, and our homeboy Rick that's going to be talking to you soon, but also, like I said, in general, speaking to people in the restoration. Now, you are really plugged in, not only to, of course, the Strangites, but also within a lot of other quarters as well. You've made yourself known. You just gave a presentation at John Whitmer, so
Sure,
you're
yeah.
well known in the scholarly community. Maybe just talk a little bit about Kyle Beshears and the restoration and your engagement with it as it stands today.
Yeah, so I enjoy dialogue. I've been involved in interreligious dialogues between Evangelical and Latter-day Saint students for the past 10 years in Utah. We're coming up on a trip in March. I've been involved a little bit with dialogues with academics, hoping to continue to participate and engage in those. The first academic presentation I ever gave was on a Strangite woman named Eunice Kinney, and that I'm polishing that up. Hopefully it'll be in a journal. Second paper I ever gave was actually at BYU's Church History Conference on the visions of Joseph Smith and James Strang. Comparing them, a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. This most recent paper was about a woman named Elvira Eliza Field, who dressed up as a boy named Charlie Douglas to pretend to be James Strang's nephew to conceal his first plural marriage. And so some things have been written about her. Vicky writes about her. Another woman, Amy Derogatis, has written on, there's a daguerreotype of Charlie. And then I looked at, Charlie actually published letters of Strang's newspaper. And so I kind of looked at her writings. That was fascinating in that paper. And then I'm presently writing an introductory book to the Latter-day Saint faith and tradition for an evangelical publisher, Craigle, called 40 Questions About Mormonism. And that'll be due out at the end of the year, if not beginning of next year.
Well, this is very exciting. So we're going to have him back on to talk about the book.
Sure. Well, more in book reviews.
Of course, we're going to talk about books, right? That's what it's all about, folks. And so, Kyle, I just want to thank you so much for coming on today. I think it's really awesome. You made the drive from Mobile, and getting to know you better. I got to meet you at Whitmer, and you're just a really awesome, cool dude. And I really appreciate what you're doing, because I think, and I'm glad I found a friend, a homie.
Yeah, of course.
That we can talk like this for hours and go on, but we got to cut it short because we got to have some tangents in the house, right? But I just want to thank you, and I just want to ask you: do you have any final words you'd like to share with the audience?
Read more about Strang. Yeah, reading that's not a selfish thing. It's a fascinating story. Start with Vicky Speaks' book.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And you ought to have her on.
She definitely will be coming on.
Yeah.
So, folks, I just want to thank you so much for sitting through this presentation. I know there are many of you who belong to various branches of the Church of the Restoration. Also, a lot of evangelicals out there who are fascinated with this story. I hope this episode has been a good introduction to James Strang for you, because it is a phenomenal story, and I wish I spent more time on it, but hey, I got this guy. I can just give him a phone call. So I want you to leave in the comments, what did you think about this story? What do you think about James Strang and the claims that he made? And I want to also hear from atheists and in my audience as well, because I'm always fascinated to get a naturalistic view of these things as well. So just remember a few things, folks. In the description, if you would like to financially support the channel, you can support us via PayPal, as well as Patreon, as well as the merch store, MormonBookReviews.com, where you can purchase some fine quality products, including something like this hat. And we'll have links in the descriptions to the books that we talked about as well. And I just want to remind you, folks, the most important thing is all the voices of the Restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews. 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 On Mormon Book Reviews.